Today, we are very fortunate to not only have these wearables tell us whether we're good or bad with that, but how we can improve our health. And John Wang from Johnson & Johnson is going to provide us information and insights about a project that they are doing with Apple to help inform AFib. So I'm going to give a little background about John. He is currently the head of integrated evidence in cardiovascular and metabolism at Johnson & Johnson. So, John, I'm expecting that you probably have the best heart here and the best metabolism, and you can maybe shed a few good notes or good comments about that to the rest of us. In his role, he looks at real-world health economic data sets, and so he was tapped to lead this project. He's going to tell us how they actually came about to partnering with Apple. John, in his previous career, he has also been the executive director at the U.S. Medical Affairs for Amgen. He's the president of Real Endpoints, a consultant at McKinsey, and he, on top of that, is a cardiologist. He did work at, he was a doctor at Morristown Medical Center. He's a graduate of Harvard and Columbia University. Quite impressive. We're very excited to have John Wang present to us today. John. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. First of all, I just wanted to say this program is absolutely phenomenal. So I was speaking with Raghu earlier and Mary, and really among your peer set, I can't think of anything quite actually similar. So kudos to you, Eric. Kudos to Jeff for supporting you. I just want to give you a round of applause. This is really very differentiated. So thank you for having us here. So I'm the token healthcare talk. What I wanted to talk about was the deal that we did with Apple and why we did it and how we sort of got there, as Mary said, what it really has to do with analytics. So, you know, as a manufacturer in pharmaceuticals, what we do is we have to generate data. We have to generate evidence to get our products approved through the FDA, highly regulated environment. And it's really not very much a customer experience-driven process, and our products really aren't about customer experience. It's about efficacy and safety, but it's not about whether the box opens in a very nice, smooth way. It's not really about that. It's about really whether you actually have an impact on clinical outcomes. So our data has to be really robust, and it requires a lot of work to get that data. So typically, we do it through clinical studies. And clinical studies look like this. There is a clinical trial that's designed, and then sites, bricks and mortar sites, open up, and you start to have physicians try to identify people who meet the entry criteria, and they come into the study, and then they get randomized, and then you go forth with the study. The bottleneck in that whole process is actually in the clinical sites. So this bricks and mortar approach really slows things down. And what we need to do in our industry is, given the pricing pressures, and we're all sort of aware of the drug pricing debate, we really need to be able to do our evidence generation much more efficiently, much more cost effectively. So that was sort of the internal narrative that I had to put together, just speaking to Charles Thomas's point before about how do you storytell. Really, you're storytelling internally to convince all the people who say no, because it's easy to say no. And what we had to do was sort of tell this story about why it was really important, why it mattered to the business, because there's a bit of a disconnect between the data that we generate and the end result, which may actually be years later in terms of a commercialization opportunity. You kind of have to weave that story and connect the dots for people, because to Charles' point, from analytics to action to impact, you've got to be able to have a very tight story around that. So this is the challenge that we face in that clinical study model that I just described. One is that 5% of all eligible patients, on average, for most of these clinical studies actually participate. We just can't get people into the study. Why? Because they don't want to be randomized to something that may not work, or they don't want to get something that actually may harm them because it's an experimental therapy. 20% of studies all shut down because you just can't roll enough. You have to have a certain effect size, certain number of people in the study. You can't get there. 30% dropout rate. Why? Because life. People have things happen, they don't show up for follow-up, things just don't happen the way you anticipate, and this is the impact. So I know that there's a lot of debate about the actual cost per drug, but if you factor in the failures, it's $2 billion. It's about 600 million per if you just do soup to nuts for the single straight shot that wins, but if you factor in the failures, it's 2 billion. Okay, so what we did was in 2017-18, we said, okay, let's do a tiny, tiny pilot. What we did was we took kind of a wearable. It's not really a wearable in the way we think of wearable. It's a patch. It's something that you stick on the body for 2 weeks, and it measures your heart rhythm, and that's kind of what it looks like. It's called the iRhythm. Just put it on people, and what we did was we randomized people to a patch versus not a patch. So you're looking for this arrhythmia, or you're not looking. And the standard of care is not to look, right? Because we don't have that stuff attached to us as we walk around. So we looked at people who are at risk of AFib, so slightly older, and who are at risk of stroke, because this irregular heart rhythm predisposes to stroke. We then did it not through bricks and mortar. We used payer claims data, and we did virtual recruitment. We did mail, snail mail, whatever means to try to get people to come in, not through these bricks and mortar sites, but to enroll remotely. And then we virtually instrumented them, meaning that we sent them this patch if they were randomized to the arm that got the patch. So we just mailed it to them. So we tried to get rid of the bricks and mortar model. And what did we do? We looked at the payer claims to see whether they had better outcomes or they used more resources in one area versus another. And we looked at the ECG tracing to see if actually we detected more AFib, the arrhythmia. You with me? Okay. So here are our partners. Scripps was the academic institution, NIH. We worked with them pretty closely. Aetna was the claims partner for us. Healthogen is their research arm, and of course us. So what did we find? So in those who got a patch versus those who didn't get a patch, what we found was naturally we diagnosed more, right? It's about threefold increase approximately. So that's good. That's what we kind of expected. But what was unexpected was that the hospitalizations went down. So those people who got a patch didn't go to the hospital, and I'm not showing the data, they went to the cardiologists. Those who didn't have a patch went to the hospital or to the emergency department. So what happened was, and this was our whole hypothesis actually, was that just to speak in business terms, the value chain shifted. The patient flow and entry point went from high cost to lower cost. And it kind of makes sense because you're detecting the AFib earlier, so it's not as severe, and so you have more time to be redirected to an outpatient setting that's lower cost. Now, we haven't done the cost analysis yet. We're looking at the data tables, but fundamentally, we think that this is going to save a lot of money despite the fact that you're diagnosing more. So Francis Collins tweeted about this, blogged about it, and said, hey, this is really great. You guys are doing things differently. This is the first time we did that anyone's done sort of a randomized remote study. So we felt empowered, but to get to Apple was a big leap. And I think one of the things that we learned in going this route from this pilot, because you can sometimes end up in pilot purgatory, where things just go and go and go. And really, we thought that what we've seen is that pilots are really meant to be killed. They're not meant for success. There are more reasons to quickly kill it if it doesn't work the way you want it. But it's not really a commitment, and it's not a pilot towards something else. It's a pilot to actually step back. So we said we can't do that because we see how the market is evolving. We see how wearables are penetrating. We see where tech companies are going. We want to be where the puck is going to be. So Heartline is the name of the study that we're doing with Apple. We're pretty tight-vested. We're holding things tight to the vest right now about the study. That's because Apple wants us to. We typically don't operate that way. We usually are very transparent. But right now, the left side of the slide is more about the old school, where you have limited number of events, and this is even true for the mSToPS study that I showed before. There's not many patients. There's about 2,000 patients. Clean data is not really available because what we had to do is had to scrub the data that came in from the study, and that's about the scale of data that we got from that study. In the Heartline study, we're going up to 150,000 people. It's going to be totally remote, e-consent, all through an app with the watch, with the iPhone. So we're going to get about a 50-fold increase in the number of study participants. That's what we hope. Clean data in that as it comes in, it's highly structured. And we'll talk a little bit about how do you get to that point where you're really leveraging analytics. You really have to understand the structure of the data in advance so that it's actually analyzable. Otherwise, it's a total mess. And we're talking about a factor of 100 to 1,000 more fold in terms of data. But to get there, you need to have hypotheses. And I think this is what you're hearing in terms of a theme here, is that you've got to apply your business knowledge, your intuition, your understanding, all the things that Raghu was telling you about before and that Charles was talking about. These are the things that you need to apply. You need to understand the business and the market dynamics up front so that you can structure the data, you can then apply the machine learning in the right way, and so that you can get the analytics that you need, and you need to also build the internal capabilities, and that's really around people and processes. So going from the old school to the new school, it's actually the middle part that's actually probably the most important. It's not about the data. It really is, and I know they say it's data and analytics, it's actually about the thinking that goes behind everything. So why? Why is that really important? So let me give you an example. I don't know if people know about the Women's Health Initiative. It was an NIH-sponsored study. What they did was they looked at data and they did a large retrospective analysis, and they found that women who got estrogen seemed to do better. And that actually affected guidelines. Someone said, well, wait a minute, I'm not really sure if that analysis and the analytics, it's retrospective, it's not prospective, there could be confounding variables, we don't really know, let's do a randomized study. What happened was that they found that they were actually killing people. So in healthcare, the stakes are really, really high if you don't do things right. In business, I'll start with the last one first, you could destroy value because you've got the insight and you're going down the wrong road. And what happens is that you distract people, you lose time, which is a competitive disadvantage, and in the case of healthcare, you end up hurting people. So analytics are not the answer. Data by itself, and I say this per se, are not the answer. It's the combination, this is exactly why I'm so impressed with what you guys are doing, is you're putting the two together in terms of the data and analytics with the capabilities, the internal capabilities at the company that you need to have to really get to where you need to be. Otherwise, you could actually hurt yourself. So I'm just going to back up here in terms of sort of why we entered into this collaboration with Apple. This slide basically shows the incremental increase in spend over the next 4 to 5 years as projected by the CBO and by CMS. So you can see here the biggest contribution is in professional services and hospital care. So that's the way the current system is designed. So it's just going to increase in cost quite a bit. So we need to move away from this because, as you know, these are very big businesses. Hospitals are huge. There's $1 billion business in almost every town in the US. That's because there's a hospital. Professional services, we're talking about huge delivery systems and physicians. So that's hundreds of billions of dollars. How are they going to stay in business? By maintaining their current revenue or growing it. So to imagine that you're going to bend the cost curve and solve healthcare costs using this current system doesn't make any sense. So you have to step out of it and you have to say, okay, what is it that we can do differently outside the system or redirect things in a way that this current dynamic doesn't play out. And what we see, of course, is wearables. So here you see an increased penetration in wearables. This is projected, and they're becoming a lot more powerful. So in the case of the Apple Watch, the Series 4, there's a technology called PPG, photoplasmathography. Anyway, can measure pulse. I think a lot of the Fitbits and whatnot have it. And now they can do an EKG, which is an electrical tracing of the heart. Single lead, but it can be done. Now it's a consumer wearable, so you can take your own EKG. So, and they're becoming far more powerful, what with algorithms. The sensors are phenomenally sensitive now. So for example, in Parkinson's, where you have the pill rolling behavior in the hand, it's far more sensitive than a clinical diagnosis, which is how we do things now. We sort of eyeball people and say, ooh, it looks like they're pill rolling a little bit more. It's not a great way to do things. So the technology, as you know, the cycle times are incredibly rapid. It's about 18-month cycle time. And you can imagine that in 3, 5, 7 years, there's going to be a huge transformation in the capabilities of the devices as it relates to healthcare. Given that, and we know where the puck is going, we wanted to be there. So that was the commitment, and that was the story internally to get Alex and Tim Cook together in a room in that spaceship building to talk about what does the future of healthcare look like and what can we do together. Why Apple? I know that more people in the US and the world use Android, but what we wanted was in-market presence. And I kept on telling people, despite the fact that there are more people with other devices, and I know there's a skew toward wealthy in this population segment. We just need in-market presence because we need to understand how things play out in the market. This theoretical idea of like, well, there are more people otherwise with other devices mattered a little bit less. It mattered who was in the market now, because that's where we're going to find out the information, because only the market dynamic is really where you learn. And they're investing in healthcare very heavily. So the collaboration is between Apple and J&J. The study launch will be sometime in Q4 of this year. And it's basically around their watch, the Series 4 watch in particular. And this Heartline app that we're co-developing with them to bring people in through this whole process that's related to clinical studies, which requires consent, and then they have to do a flow through trial engagement. And then there's a 2-year engagement plan where they're actually following some behaviors. We're trying to modify the behavior to improve outcomes while we're trying to detect their AFib in the background as the watch just sits on their wrist. So there's the app, and the key inputs are the sensors from the watch. So there's accelerometers, there's gyroscope, there's PPG, there's ECG, there's GPS. And we can talk a lot about the privacy, but again, you can imagine how tough Apple is on privacy. I think that we're all covered there. But we're going to get a lot of information from the watch. We're using claims and pulling them from CMS, the Blue Button API, to understand what the resource utilization is and use that to determine clinical outcomes. So if someone comes in with an MI, a heart attack, we're going to know it. So we're going to be able to capture all that data. And then finally, we're going to actually be interacting with participants, asking them patient-reported outcomes. That's what PROs stand for. How do you feel? These are all validated in the literature, and asking them about symptoms along the way, and also their experience. So imagine if you're going to the ED versus going to a cardiologist's office. Not that going to a cardiologist's office is so fun, but ED's worse. We just know that. So we want the patient experience. We want to get a sense of whether that's actually improved as well as we alter the way in which patients engage health care and the way in which they then are being put through the healthcare system. Now, to get to all the data that comes in from all these sources, all these things had to happen. We had to sort of go through privacy, and we're still going through privacy issues with Apple to make sure that we're aligned, because they're not used to doing studies and collecting aggregate data. That's not something that they like to do. Going through regulatory through our law department, the FDA, and the anti-kickback through the DOJ, actually having conversations there. Obviously compliance, because we're in a highly regulated industry. Security, that's just table stakes. Data structure and analytics, we talked about this before, to make sure that you're getting the right data structure so you can do the right analytics that make sense. Otherwise, it's a waste of time. And data rights. This was kind of unique because of the collaboration between Apple and J&J, who owns what. A little bit complicated, but it's all very doable as long as you have a very clear understanding of what you want. You have to do a little bit of trading, but you can get there. So these are just some, don't take pictures. These are some proprietary wireframes. What we're trying to do is we're trying to engage patients and give them information about what they can provide to the provider. So the watch transmits its data to the health app on the phone, creates a PDF. We want them to be able to pull that PDF and show it to the physician, whomever is taking care of them, so that information can be transferred about, well, what is it they felt at the time, what is it that they had at the time, et cetera, so that they're informed both on the patient side and the provider side. Preparing for your appointment, what you need to do, and then we're actually doing a feedback mechanism in terms of number of points overall, not specific to them, because that would be a little bit creepy. That was the feedback we got from user testing, that if we kind of knew what they were doing, they would sort of not like it. So it's more aggregated over the number of people who've engaged to a certain extent, where they're located, and whatnot. By the way, this graphic of Alan Greenspan, I don't know why Apple chose that, but we've asked them to remove that as the icon there. I'm not really sure why they got that there. It's really weird. Okay, maybe because he's old and he looks like he needs this program. Well, that was it. So I think the key messages are data analytics are really great. What matters is what they do to behavior in the market and how people see value. And I think that's sort of the goal of it. It's another point, another input, and keeping in mind the limitations of it are really important as you go about this journey. Thank you.
Well, thank you, John. I am hoping, I'm going to ask you now if possibly in 2 years when the project's done, if you'll come back to the audience and tell us how it went when you get all the results.
Sure, would love to.
Okay, great.
Well,
great.
we hope to have some interim results out along the way as well. We've sort of built that into the analysis plan so that we can have the drumbeat of news coming out along the way as opposed to just going away for 2 years.
Okay, so when it's available for the public consumption, we'd like to get a preview of that. So we have a lot of questions coming in, and wow, it's rapid fire here. I'll just start with this first one. What other diagnosis or applications outside of AFib do you foresee in this collaboration, and also any other collaboration that you can talk about?
Yeah, so yeah, we're in deep discussions now about what's next. So I think one area is what we call central nervous system, or CNS, mood. Suicide is the #1 cause of death in people in the 20s, which is really sad. And we really want to have an impact there. So the technology is actually getting to be quite good with various inputs. So you can imagine typing speed, cadence of speech, GPS activity, actigraphy, which is sleep, if you're not sleeping or sleeping too much, facial recognition. When you put those in the right combination, you can start to get a sense of whether someone is actually tipping more into depression, or if they're already diagnosed as depressed, if they're becoming treatment resistant, what we call TRD, treatment resistant depressive. And we think that that's one of the next big areas. So CNS, I talked about Parkinson's. There's also cognition. Alzheimer's is a huge problem. We don't have great therapies, though, so we're not really sure how we're going to be able to manage that, because if you diagnose but you can't do anything, I don't know if that's such a great thing. So there's that. There's a lot now in orthopedics because of movement and steps. Naturally, that one works out well as well, given where the technology can intersect with the current sort of unmet needs in the healthcare space. And that's all more of a passive area where the device on your wrist is just passively detecting things potentially. Where things get interesting is where it becomes active, where you're asking people to provide, let's say, a saliva sample, and that they could put it into a little device that plugs into your phone that has a microarray chip that can start to look for DNA that is indicative of either a viral spike or a tumor spike or whatever it is that you're thinking about, that can then help diagnose things sooner or change treatment faster without your having to go to the doctor, without having to go get blood tests at LabCorp Quest. It's more continual data feedback mechanisms to alter your course of care and to improve outcomes. So we think this is all very much in the horizon within 10 years.
Okay, great. Following up on that particular question, this feels very helpful to test participants' health. And the question came up, how are you managing a control group, and what happens to them, and how is that being set up? Because that would be critical in validating the results.
Yeah, so the way we're doing it is we're randomizing. So we're randomizing to watch versus no watch. So you think, oh, well, I'm sure among most people here, well, most people might want to watch. When we did user testing in the 65 and over, most people actually don't want the watch. It's funny. So we're going to have to sort of figure out how to get people in. But that's the solve, which is just to randomize around, you're going to get a watch, you're not going to get a watch, and you're going to move forward, and you're going to have that control, because most of us don't have a watch and don't actually use it to measure for the presence of AFib. So I think that's the solution. Whether we can execute is a whole other question, but we're working toward the solve of that.
Here, earlier today, Charles Thomas mentioned the single most challenge is change management. Is that true at J&J? And if so, how is J&J dealing with that? Maybe in the context of this particular project.
Yeah, we're not dealing well. No, we're not dealing well. First of all, the clock speed is much slower in pharma, only because we're used to timelines and patent lives of 7 to 10 years or whatever. Product cycle timelines, as I said, for tech companies are 18 months. And just getting teams spun up as quickly as we need is really a challenge. So I think this is actually probably one of the most important learnings from the study so far, even though the study hasn't launched, is that we now have people who know what it feels like to be operating at a faster speed. That's really hard to get a company to do. I mean, it's really, really hard. We've got now a small group, and what we need to do is try to formalize the mechanisms by which they got there so we can actually inculcate the rest of the company to do it at that speed. It's been a huge lift already, and it's going to be a lift as we sort of grow this. So in answer to your question, it's a huge problem, and I think it's going to be found everywhere that some collaboration of this sort happens.
So with that, J&J has chosen to partner with Apple. And do you feel like you're ahead of some of your other competitors because of this experience and because it is pushing and throttling you forward with this technology and how you'll be able to potentially provide better outcomes for individuals? Or is this a commonplace? I haven't heard many other pharma companies do this. I know of one, but where do you think you are in that sphere?
So I would say that in terms of the application of the approach, which is virtual and moving away from bricks and mortars, maybe not so unique to us. Others are doing it, but the difference is scale.
Okay.
So we hear of people doing studies within systems, New Orleans, Geisinger. These are integrated systems that have good IT systems, and all the physicians are employed, so you can tell them what to do. There's more uniformity of care, but it's one system. How do you scale that? So what we're trying to solve for, and where I think we're ahead in learning, is how to scale these things so that it goes across systems, multi-state, and then we're able to gather data in a broadest population as opposed to a single delivery systems population. So I think we already have learnings I think that others probably don't have, and that's, I think, really, really valuable.
And do you think the brand name of J&J and Apple, is that going to help propel the acceptance of this? Or assuming the study goes as planned and going out to market, will you be using those brand names associated with the Heartline application, or was it Heartline? Is that what it is? Will you use those other brands to help with that when you put it to market, or?
Yeah, when you say put it to market, I guess the commercialization of it? Yeah, so I think that commercial model has still not been defined. Apple's not clear about how they want to sort of monetize their efforts in health. And I think we're not sure either in terms of this particular model. Certainly having the brand name recognition and the trust vis-a-vis privacy, vis-a-vis the focus on health, vis-a-vis your best interest, because actually in Heartline, I just want to point out, there's no J&J product in the game. We actually don't have any skin in the game at this point. The reason is that we didn't want to seem to be tainted, and really for compliance reasons, it looks very bad. What we wanted to do is say, here are the key learnings that we're going to take from this, and we're going to be in the front in terms of learning how to do this, taking data analytics and wearables. So our framework is data, devices, and delivery, care delivery. Taking it into the market so we can alter care delivery, so we can change the value equation and make it more cost effective. Bring that in-house in a way that we can then deploy in our product development so that we have a more compelling story for our customers. So back to your question, yes, I think we will be leveraging the brands.
This question came in. What's the FDA's view on data from wearables, and how close are we to pivotal trials where this is the sole source of data for new product approval?
So the FDA is really excited. So when we engaged with them, they really love the idea of what they call decentralized studies, which is non-bricks and mortar. They really want wearables to be incorporated because they see as well that wearables are going to be penetrating the market, and physicians are already being asked, well, what do I do with the information that the patients are presenting to them? So they know that they have to get ahead of this. I think that there always has to be a triangulation between the wearables and some other data source that proves improved clinical outcomes, like whether you had a heart attack, stroke, whether there was recurrence of a tumor, whether there was worsening of an inflammatory condition like Crohn's or rheumatoid arthritis. You always need some other metric to triangulate or to work with the wearable data. But we're finding, for example, in some cases, the wearable data is better than the clinical data. I talked about the Parkinson's. It's far more sensitive. One of the questions as well that the FDA had asked was, okay, what if someone takes the watch off and puts it on someone else? How do you know, in other words, the watch that was provisioned for the original subject actually is with the original subject 2 years later? The accelerometer is so sensitive that you can actually pattern the gait of someone who has a watch and say, that's the same individual who had the watch 2 years ago. So the technology is rapidly getting to the point that the FDA, so when we said to the FDA, hey, we could do this, they're like, okay, great. So that question got taken care of. There are a whole host of questions, but I think the market is moving there, the FDA is moving there, and we wanted to be there. So I think it will get there, perhaps not with the wearable alone per se, but in conjunction with claims, with what we call case report forms or electronic health records that show that someone had a clinical event. And putting it all together, at some point, there's going to be a tipping point, probably not in the next 5 years, but soon that wearables will be a single source of data, I think, which is what the question is, for an approval of a drug or a device.
Okay. Now, one of those slides, I think it was the second to last slide, you were showing all the different areas of input for the data that you needed to collect. And the data security and from the Apple Watch, and then there was something from, I think you said the patient, it wasn't a patient record, it was what did you call it?
Claims blue button?
Claims blue button. So there's a lot of data sources. How is J&J managing all those data sources? And is Apple partaking in that, or who's owning the data stacks and how you're going at it? Is it a combined team, or could you explain a little bit about that?
Yeah, it's a combined team. So their devices, the phone and the watch, connects directly to their back-end stack, which they totally de-identify. But there are a lot of proprietary streams that come from their devices into their back-end data stack. And they're not willing to share that. Totally makes sense. We wouldn't want to sort of get into that and get into their grill about that stuff. But what we are working with them is integrating the claims data with whatever synthesized data they're collecting from their devices with the patient-reported outcome, the surveys essentially, that are coming from the app, so that we can get a holistic view in a combined way in the level that they feel comfortable sharing, that we can then use to create a more holistic picture of the patient from a claims point of view, a sensor point of view, and from the patient's self-reported symptoms.
I mean, true collaboration from both of your companies, in terms of that having to be critical to the success of the project.
Yeah, so one thing I think also that's been mentioned is from the top. So having Alex and Tim, Jeff Williams is actually the CEO, who's actually the one who's all things health at Apple. He's the one assigned to it. Met with him multiple times to get agreement, and if there's a decision has to be made, we just go right to him to make that call so that the whole organization can then get aligned. It's unfortunate on some level that you have to sort of use the flagpole to your advantage. I wish it could just sort of be decentralized and sort of everyone talks about pushing the decision down to the lowest level, but sometimes at these big corporations, the best way is just to go up.
Okay. So we have time for one more question, and this is a question of mine, and that is, I would really like to know if you could describe your journey, how you went from being a cardiologist into this role at Johnson & Johnson, and why you put yourself in front of that role, or how you were handpicked for that role. And if you could just share a little bit of light on that.
Yeah, sure. So it all started when I was having a Christmas conversation at one point, I don't know, with an attorney friend. This was when I was in practice, or I was in charge of the service line at Morristown, and then about 6 months later, I got a call from some guy at McKinsey. He said, I heard that you were thinking of leaving medicine. I was like, what are you talking about? First of all, who are you? And how'd you get my name? And why do you think that? And so my friend had, I guess, somehow heard something in my voice. Anyway, ended up there. And
be careful what you say at a Christmas
party.
Yeah, I know,
right? Christmas party of all things, right? Social media is nothing. So what happened was, so that was sort of the beginning. I didn't even know what McKinsey was.
Okay.
I had no idea what it was. And it kind of opened up the idea that innovation is really where I wanted to be. So in the hospital setting, it was all about cost cutting, about process improvement. That wasn't the kind of innovation I was interested in. When I saw what could happen in life sciences, and especially with the advent of digital and wearables, I said, okay, this is where I want to be. Mm-hmm. So as part of this project, it was a former McKinsey person as well, who I knew when I was there, who went to Apple. We started talking in the background and said, we should do something. So that was how this happened. And it was just about making and working the way up through both organizations to make sure that it happens. So,
well, thank you for sharing that. And let's give John a round of applause. Thank you so very much.
Thank you. Thank you.